The carbon pricing watch, as you just referred to, was released by us earlier in the Expo. And I think it sort of captures where we are in the world with various types of carbon pricing mechanisms. Last September at the UN Secretary General's Climate Finance Summit, we saw this tremendous momentum build around carbon pricing with over 1,000 private sector companies, including investors, nearly 75 countries and about 25 different sort of jurisdictions, subnational type jurisdictions, actually signing up for it. This particular, the carbon pricing watch, the brief we put out, sort of actually documents where these mechanisms are. So there are 40 countries, nearly 40 countries, and over 20 sort of regional or sort of subnational jurisdictions.
So we're already seeing a great deal of climate leadership on carbon pricing.
We definitely are. In total, the carbon pricing mechanisms, both market-based and taxes, are worth about 48 billion today. It is definitely much lower than what the carbon markets themselves were some years ago, but you're absolutely right that the momentum is building back, and the big difference I think is that there is traction across the sort of different kinds of economic players.
We've seen their precedents in many emerging economies, from Chile to South Africa to Kazakhstan, to develop their own carbon pricing, but how can you give assistance to these economies that for them it's not a natural, it seems like quite an alien concept, pricing carbon in a country where poverty reduction and other things are so key?
Right, so a lot of these countries are still sort of on a very steep upward trajectory for growth, and clearly with growth there's going to be emissions. So planning ahead for that is how we have a program called the Partnership for Market Readiness that actually has nearly 40 participants, several donors, but also 18 countries who are directly benefiting from the technical assistance this platform provides. And the whole idea behind the platform is to support countries in doing some ideally market-based mechanism, but any sort of carbon pricing mechanism that is best suited to their sort of economic low carbon growth strategy.
So would you now say we are approaching a critical mass of countries that are adopting some elements of some carbon initiative, be it 70 countries or 100. But in the interim, we're not there yet. So what can the World Bank do to kind of plant the seed in countries which haven't yet considered such initiatives?
So I think given this momentum, supporting this momentum, like I mentioned, the Partnership for Market Readiness, there's a lot of knowledge that is coming out of it, from how to establish market-based mechanisms like emissions trading systems to how to put in place monitoring and reporting systems, and we want to share this with as many as possible. We also want to be able to do something with the countries who are actually putting in place these carbon pricing mechanisms. These are going to result in greenhouse gases, which are sort of the results we're all looking for. So how do we monetize these results? So we actually have a couple of funds already in place. One is called the Carbon Partnership Facility, and we are working on building another fund which will actually monetize these outcomes, help these countries in the absence of a formal carbon market. It is going to help these countries actually translate action into money.
Okay. Now we know in this brave new world of bottom-up climate diplomacy, or whatever you'll call it, how can we ensure that these carbon taxes or whatever they are actually significant and they're going to effectively tackle global warming rather than just paying lip service to it?
So I think you've hit upon the biggest issue around this bottom-up approach. I think the bottom-up approach is in fact good, which is a lot of where we are headed into Paris with. And the reason is this allows countries to do what is best for them as they see it. Hence, I guess, the nationally determined contributions. But what you're going to end up with is a very fragmented, heterogeneous sort of a marketplace, if we can even call it that, because every country is going to have its own approach to pricing carbon, and even the market-based mechanisms are going to look very different. So we have this open source type platform where we are trying to actually look ahead to see how do you bring some level of fungibility in these markets? How do you create the liquidity that will be needed in order for finance to flow to the low carbon investments. It's called the Network Carbon Markets Initiative, and it's collaborating across the spectrum with civil society, with financial institutions, with rating agencies, as well as academia, to see what the institutions and services, what kind of institutions and services would be needed for a future market where you could then have a predictable and robust international sort of market.
And just finally, looking ahead to this Crunch Paris summit at the end of the year, currently with the negotiating text at around 90 pages, I think carbon pricing is mentioned just once or twice. But how can we ensure that when this is whittled down, it remains? Given what's riding on this Paris summit and the fact that carbon pricing is such a core plank of the UNFCCC strategy.
I'm not sure I would be in a position to say how we ensure it happens, but we must have it. The agreement must have a reference to markets and market mechanisms in order to ultimately support countries' ambitions. You are going to need this. And I think a lot of countries are beginning to recognize that. My conversations at the Expo with both government officials as well as UNFCCC officials and the private sector, which is represented here in big numbers, is that I think there is a palpable optimism around the fact that Paris will include language around markets, that there is more needs to be done than what ambition needs to be supported. And that's going to be very difficult to do with our markets. Now, we don't need all the rules laid out in Paris. In fact, I think we shouldn't have rules laid out in Paris, but that can follow very quickly. But the whole idea of opening the door to saying markets are in fact an efficient way to disseminate the signals needed across economies in order to sort of mobilize financing and get it to the most efficiently get it to the low carbon investments that we need.